The smell of stale coffee and betrayal clung to the air, a bitter contrast to the sweet fragrance of the lilies clutched in Emily's trembling hands. It was their third wedding anniversary, a day that had begun with whispered promises and soft kisses from her husband, Lucas Grant. Now, standing outside the sleek glass and steel tower of Grant Enterprises, a wave of nausea, sharper than her usual morning sickness, rolled through her. It wasn't just the 6 months of pregnancy pressing on her bladder. It was a gut-deep dread, a chilling whisper that a serpent had slithered into her perfect life. The serpent, she would soon learn, wore designer silk and was lounging comfortably in her chair. Emily had always believed in fairy tales. How could she not? She was living one. She came from a modest upbringing, working as a junior art conservator when she met Lucas Grant, the billionaire real estate tycoon, at a charity gala. He was older, devastatingly handsome, with eyes the color of a storm-tossed ocean that seemed to see every secret in her heart. He had courted her with an old-school charm, showering her with affection, respect, and a life she had once only imagined. Their wedding had been extravagant, featured in Modern Society magazine, and their life in their penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan was, by anyone's measure, idyllic. Now, 6 months pregnant with their first child, a boy, Emily felt a fullness she'd never known before. Lucas had been ecstatic about the baby, more attentive and loving than ever. He'd overseen every detail of the nursery himself, a soft haven of pale blues and creams with a hand-painted mural of drifting hot air balloons. He would rest his head on her belly for hours, telling their unborn son all about the adventures they would have and the empire he would one day inherit. That very morning had been no different. He'd woken her with a gentle kiss, a single perfect red rose on her pillow, and the whispered words, "Happy anniversary, my love. Tonight we celebrate." He'd told her he had an important board meeting, but promised he'd be home early for a special dinner he had planned. Emily had spent the day in a cloud of blissful anticipation. She'd treated herself to a prenatal massage, bought an elegant new maternity dress from Seraphine, and decided to surprise Lucas at his office with his favorite lunch, a custom bento box from Nobu. She wanted to see his face, that breathtaking smile that always made her feel like the most loved woman alive. As she stepped out of the private elevator that opened straight into the executive floor of Grant Enterprises, her heart fluttered with excitement. She was greeted by Lucas's long-suffering but impeccably courteous secretary, a woman in her late 50s named Helen. "Mrs. Grant, what a lovely surprise," Helen said, her smile a touch tighter than usual. "Mr. Grant is in a meeting at the moment." "Oh, I know," Emily replied, her own smile bright and carefree. "He told me it was an important one. I just wanted to drop off his lunch and these." She lifted the bouquet of white lilies, Lucas's favorite. Helen's eyes darted, just for a heartbeat, toward the double doors of Lucas's office, a flicker so quick Emily almost missed it. "Of course, I can take them in for you." "Nonsense, Helen. I'll just peek in for a second." "He won't mind," Emily said lightly, her voice breezy with playful excitement. She moved toward the doors, her heart fluttering. "Mrs. Grant, perhaps it's best to wait." Helen's voice cracked slightly, a faint strain betraying a note of panic, but Emily was already pushing open the heavy oak doors. What met her eyes would be burned into her memory forever. A scene of such raw betrayal that it knocked the breath clean from her lungs. The office was grand and commanding, just like the man who ruled it. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of Chicago's steel and glass skyline, a concrete empire Lucas had built from the ground up. His massive walnut desk was usually a controlled mess of contracts and architectural sketches, but today none of that mattered. It was what was happening in front of the desk that held Emily frozen. There, in the plush custom leather chair that Lucas had always called Emily's chair, the one she'd claimed during countless visits and soft late-afternoon talks, sat a woman. Her long black hair was cut into a sharp, elegant bob. She wore a silky emerald dress that hugged every curve like a secret meant to be kept and shown off at the same time. One slender leg was crossed over the other, a stiletto heel dangling lazily from her foot, its signature red sole catching the light. And kneeling before her, his head buried in her lap, was her husband, Lucas Grant. His shoulders shook, and for a foolish second, Emily thought he must be crying. The woman's hand drifted through his hair, long crimson nails grazing his scalp in slow, possessive circles. The moment stretched, an eternity balanced on the edge of a knife. No one moved. Then the bento box slipped from Emily's numb fingers, clattering onto the polished marble floor with a harsh, echoing crack that shattered the suffocating silence. Lucas's head snapped up. His storm-gray eyes, usually filled with warmth and devotion for her, were wide now, with shock, guilt, and something darker she couldn't quite name. A flicker of anger, maybe. But the woman in the chair didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head, a slow, deliberate motion, her lips curling into a smug, knowing smile. A slow, deliberate tilt of her head and a smug, triumphant smile spread across her perfectly painted lips. Emily knew her. Of course she did. It was Savannah Blake, the fiercely ambitious, notoriously ruthless chief operating officer of Grant Enterprises. A woman Lucas had always praised as brilliant but dangerous. Emily had met her at company galas before, exchanging polite, empty words that always left her uneasy. She'd never liked her. She'd always felt something cold and sharp behind Savannah's polished charm. Now she understood exactly why. Emily? Lucas gasped, scrambling awkwardly to his feet. He looked disheveled, his usually flawless suit wrinkled, his tie hanging loose around his neck. This isn't what it looks like. The pathetic cliché fell into the tense air, sounding even more hollow against the thunderous silence in the room. Emily's mind spun, grasping for some other explanation, some lie that might make this hurt less. But there was none. The truth lay bare before her, raw and cruel. Emily's eyes moved from her husband's guilty, desperate face to Savannah, who now rose from the leather chair with slow, feline grace. Savannah was taller than Emily had realized, her presence bold and unapologetic. Her cool green eyes flicked over Emily, assessing her like prey. She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from her dress, a gesture dripping with pure arrogance. "Isn't it?" Savannah's voice purred, sweet as honey but laced with poison. "Looks to me like your dear husband just needed a little comfort. The pressures of running a multi-billion-dollar empire, you know how exhausting that can be." The mockery hit Emily like a slap. She felt the color drain from her face. A sour wave of nausea twisted in her stomach. Anger, heartbreak, betrayal fighting to break through her frozen shock. The lilies in her hand, once symbols of love and celebration, suddenly felt like a funeral wreath. "Get out of my chair." Emily's voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. Savannah arched a perfectly sculpted brow. "Your chair, darling?" She let out a soft, mocking laugh. "This is the seat of power, and as you can see, it's currently occupied." For a heartbeat, Emily's knees nearly buckled. The room, the windows, the city skyline blurred behind the sharp edges of her tears she refused to let fall. "Lucas," Emily's voice cracked as she finally turned her eyes to her husband, silently begging him to fix this, to deny everything, to end this nightmare. "Tell her to leave." Lucas raked a shaky hand through his hair. His face was drawn tight with shame and confusion. He glanced from his broken-hearted pregnant wife to his cool, unfazed mistress. The silence pulsed like a wound, devouring the last shreds of Emily's perfect life. "Savannah." Lucas finally spoke, his voice strained. "Maybe you should go." Savannah let out a low, sultry laugh. "Go? But we were just getting to the best part, weren't we, Lucas? The part where you tell me how you're done with this." She waved a dismissive hand at Emily. "This relic of a marriage, and finally choose a woman who understands your world. Your hunger." "That's enough," Lucas snapped, anger flashing in his eyes. But the damage was already done. The words hung between them, venomous and undeniable. A sudden, sharp pain stabbed through Emily's abdomen. She gasped, her hand flying instinctively to her belly. The room began to spin, the panoramic view of the city dissolving into a kaleidoscope of mocking lights. "Emily," Lucas cried out, taking a step toward her. "Don't touch me," she whispered, the words laced with a pain so raw it cut deeper than any blade. It felt like a force pressing her backward. She stumbled a step away, then another, her eyes locked on his. In that instant, she didn't see her loving husband, the father of her baby. She saw a stranger, a liar, a betrayer. The taste of betrayal burned in her throat like acid, choking back a scream that threatened to claw its way out. Summoning a strength she never knew she had, Emily turned and fled. She didn't hear Lucas calling her name. She didn't hear Savannah's low, mocking laugh behind her. The only sound was the frantic, terrified pounding of her own heart, a relentless drumbeat marking the death of her dream. She stumbled past Helen, who looked horrified and tried to steady her. "Mrs. Grant, are you all right? Let me call." But Emily shook her head, pushing past her without a word. She ran toward the elevator, breath shuddering in ragged sobs. Just before the doors slid shut, she caught a final glimpse of Lucas standing in the office doorway, his face twisted in despair. But it was too late. The glass had shattered, the shards too sharp and too tiny to ever fit back together. The fairy tale was gone. In its place stood a brutal, merciless truth. A pregnant wife, a cheating husband, a mistress bold enough to sit in her chair. A battle line had been drawn that afternoon in that gleaming corner office, and Emily, with her unborn child as her only ally, knew she would have to fight. Inside the tight elevator, she pressed her forehead to the cold mirrored wall, fighting the urge to sink to the floor. She bit down on her sobs, afraid the sound would break her more than she already was. The naive girl who believed in happily ever after was gone. In her place, a woman, wounded but awakening, was being forged in pain and betrayal. The elevator plunged down like a metal cage, delivering Emily back to a life that no longer fit. Each floor that ticked past felt like another layer of her old world peeling away. Their penthouse, once her sanctuary, now felt like a golden prison. The future she had cradled so carefully was nothing but ruins at her feet. She stumbled out into the bustling lobby of Grant Enterprises, a ghost draped in designer maternity silk. The security guards, men who always greeted her with warm, respectful smiles, now watched with pity and confusion as she pushed through the revolving doors and into the raw noise of downtown Chicago. The blaring horns, the wail of sirens, the chatter of strangers, everything outside felt cruelly alive compared to the silence screaming inside her head. She had no idea where she was going. Her feet moved on their own, carrying her through streets crowded with people who didn't know her pain. The city that once felt like her playground now twisted into a maze of betrayal. Every block carried a ghost. The little bistro where they'd had their first date, the lakefront park where he'd slipped a ring on her finger, the ornate theater where they'd first kissed in public, laughing like teenagers. Now, each memory stabbed like a knife. Her phone buzzed over and over in her purse. Lucas, a name that once soothed her, now made her stomach turn. She ignored it, letting each call roll to voicemail. Each unanswered ring felt like a tiny act of rebellion, a small piece of herself she was clawing back from the ruins. Finally, her legs gave out. Emily found herself standing in front of a small, independent art gallery tucked away in Old Town, a place she hadn't set foot in since her world had become consumed by the whirlwind that was Lucas Grant. It felt galaxies away from the polished, high-stakes society art auctions she now attended at his side. This place was raw, imperfect, alive, a space where art was born from passion, not profit. She stepped inside. The familiar scent of oil paint and turpentine wrapped around her like a balm, strangely soothing her shredded heart. For a fleeting moment, she wished she could peel off this ruined version of herself and step back into the girl she'd been here. Unknown, hopeful, untouched by betrayal. Behind the reception desk sat the owner, a kind-eyed bohemian woman named Claire, an early mentor to Emily back when she was just another unknown conservator with big dreams. Claire looked up, surprised, her warm smile blooming instantly. "Emily, my goodness, it's been forever." But then she caught sight of Emily's face, tear-smeared mascara, eyes hollowed out by betrayal. The smile vanished, replaced by deep worry. "My dear girl, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "I've seen the truth." There, surrounded by paint-splattered canvases and the hopeful dreams of young artists, the whole ugly story poured out of her. The anniversary, the surprise visit, the scene in that cold, gleaming office, the woman, Savannah, lounging in her chair, the smug smile, the words that shattered everything. The more she spoke, the more the words scraped her throat raw, yet she couldn't stop. Every detail felt like ripping open a wound again and again, because saying it out loud made it real. She spoke until her tears ran dry, leaving only a raw, throbbing emptiness behind. Claire listened in silence, her expression a mix of quiet rage and gentle sympathy. When Emily finally fell silent, too exhausted to sob anymore, Claire reached across the desk and took her hand. Her grip was strong, steady, a lifeline. Men like Lucas Grant, Claire said, her voice tinged with a weary kind of knowing, build kingdoms out of concrete and glass, but their hearts, often made of something far weaker, far easier to corrupt. And women like Savannah Blake, they're vultures circling above, waiting for the first crack to appear. Emily swallowed hard. Her voice trembled with a childlike plea. What am I supposed to do, Claire? I have nothing now. My life, my home, my future, everything was tied to him. No, sweetheart. Claire's voice hardened, fierce with truth. You have yourself, and you have that precious life inside you. That is not nothing. That is everything. Those simple words slammed through Emily like a heartbeat restarting after flatlining. For the first time since she'd run from that office, something other than grief stirred in her chest. A small, bright spark of rage and strength. Her fingers pressed protectively over her belly, as if promising the tiny life inside that they would rise together, no matter what it took. Meanwhile, back at Grant Enterprises, Lucas was unraveling. The second Emily had fled, he'd spun on Savannah, his voice low and dangerous. Get out, he snarled, his face pale with a mix of fury and dread. For the first time, Savannah Blake looked startled, her smug composure cracking just enough for the predator beneath to flicker. She had expected a different reaction. She had expected him to finally decisively choose her. Lucas, darling, Savannah purred, her tone silk-soft as she tried to reclaim the upper hand. This is a blessing in disguise. Now we can be together, truly together. But Lucas let out a harsh, humorless laugh that cracked through the tense air. There is no us. There was never going to be an us. The words hit Savannah like a slap. Her flawless composure fractured, peeling back to reveal raw, furious pride. A mistake? She hissed, voice rising. I am not a mistake, Lucas. I am your equal. I'm the one who understands you, who pushes you, not that simpering little doll you married. Don't you dare talk about her. Lucas's roar echoed through the cavernous office, rattling the glass walls. You don't know the first thing about her. I know she's weak, Savannah shot back, her green eyes blazing with vicious contempt. And I know you'll come crawling back to me. You always do. With that, she spun on her stiletto heel and stormed out, leaving behind only the sharp bite of expensive perfume and promises turned to ash. Now alone, the silence pressed down on Lucas like a suffocating blanket. He looked at the spilled bento box on the marble floor, the crushed lilies, the small, delicate proof of his wife's love now ruined and discarded like his own integrity. A wave of self-loathing slammed into him so violently it almost buckled his knees. What had he done? He had betrayed the only person who had ever loved him without condition. The only one who had brought warmth and color into the sterile world he'd built from stone and steel. He called her phone, again and again. Each unanswered ring twisted the knife deeper. He called her friends. He called her mother. No one had seen her. Lucas Grant, master of markets, predictor of global booms and busts, a man who could bend entire boardrooms to his will, couldn't find his own wife. And in that helplessness, an alien panic burrowed deep in his chest where certainty used to live. What he didn't know yet was that the storm rising around him was far bigger than a shattered marriage. Savannah Blake, her pride scorched and her ambitions crushed, was not the kind of woman who retreated quietly. She had been his confidant, his secret weapon, his lover. She knew every chink in his armor, every vulnerability, every fear he'd buried under power and wealth. And now, humiliated beyond measure, she had just triggered her final, most merciless plan. Yet Emily, cocooned in the quiet sanctuary of Claire's art gallery, was transforming too. The tears had fallen. The raw shock was starting to melt away, replaced by a cold, familiar clarity. She had been a fool, a naive girl playing dress-up in a world she never fully understood. But she was also a mother-to-be, and the fierce, primal instinct to protect her child now burned through her veins like wildfire. She looked at Claire, her eyes no longer swimming with despair but glittering with steel. He's not getting away with this, Claire. He thinks I'm weak. They both do. But they have no idea who they're dealing with. The battle lines were drawn. On one side, a billionaire drowning in guilt and a frantic need for redemption. On the other, a scorned mistress armed with secrets and a hunger for revenge. And caught between them, a pregnant wife who had just unearthed a strength she'd never known she had. The storm was gathering, and when it hit, it wouldn't just tear apart a marriage, it would threaten to topple an entire empire. The real drama was only beginning, and soon enough everyone would learn that hell hath no fury like a woman, and a mother scorned. The next few days blurred into a quiet, calculated fury. With Claire's help, Emily found a small, discreet apartment tucked away in a peaceful Chicago neighborhood, a far cry from the gilded penthouse that now felt like a mausoleum of shattered dreams. She changed her number, building a digital fortress around herself, a safe bubble where Lucas's endless calls and sorry not sorry texts couldn't find her. And she made the one phone call that would set the entire war in motion. She called Arthur Vance, the city's most feared divorce attorney, ruthless, brilliant, and legendary for leaving no opponent standing. "Mrs. Grant," Arthur's voice came smooth and precise over the phone. "I've been expecting your call." Emily blinked. "You have?" When a man like Lucas Grant, net worth equivalent to a small country's GDP, makes a mess this public, the vultures circle fast. Me? I prefer to be the eagle. For the first time in days, Emily felt a faint flicker of hope. "I need your help, Mr. Vance. I want out, but I want out on my terms." "And what are your terms, Mrs. Grant?" Her voice didn't waver. In fact, it grew stronger with every word. "I want to be financially independent. I want to secure my son's future. And I want to make damn sure Savannah Blake doesn't profit from my pain." There was a brief silence on the line. Then Arthur let out a low, satisfied chuckle. "Mrs. Grant, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful and very profitable partnership." His first piece of advice was deceptively simple. Do not engage with him. Do not answer his calls. Do not reply to his messages. Let him stew in his guilt. A desperate man makes mistakes, and we will be ready to pounce on every single one of them. So Emily began her new life, quiet, deliberate, hidden in plain sight. She slipped back into the art world, not as a wealthy patron's wife, but as a collaborator, a woman rebuilding herself piece by piece. She poured her knowledge of artists and her sharp eye for emerging talent into helping Claire curate a fresh, edgy exhibition at the gallery. The work grounded her, giving all her pain and rage a place to go, something that was hers and hers alone. Each brushstroke, each conversation with a young artist, stitched tiny threads of purpose through the tears inside her. Here, at least, she could control something again, even if her heart was still a battlefield. Meanwhile, Lucas was unraveling. The silence from Emily was torture he had never known. He was a man accustomed to quick fixes, money, power, influence. There was always a check to write, a favor to call in. But this was a wound he couldn't close, a void he couldn't fill. Each day without her voice, without her forgiveness, gnawed deeper than any business loss ever could. His work began to suffer. He was irritable, distracted, his Midas touch tarnishing before his eyes. Poor decisions stacked up, one after another. Rumors started to swirl in boardrooms where once his word had been law. The board of Grant Enterprises, hard-nosed men who cared only for quarterly returns, grew uneasy. And then there was Savannah. Since her dramatic exit from his office, she had become a ghost. She still showed up each day, her work immaculate, her demeanor calm, but the warmth, the conspiratorial late-night brainstorms, the stolen moments, they had vanished. She was ice. Her green eyes, once teasing and alive, now held only an Arctic professionalism that unnerved him more than any tantrum could have. She was waiting, and Lucas, master strategist, couldn't read her next move. Sometimes he caught her watching him from across the conference table, her expression so blank it chilled the blood in his veins. He tried to fix it, cornered her in her sleek office one evening, voice low and desperate. "Savannah, we need to talk." She didn't even glance up from her laptop. Her tone was surgical. "There's nothing to discuss, Lucas. We had a professional relationship that crossed a line. It's over. Now, if you'll excuse me, this quarterly report won't write itself." Her cold detachment rattled him to the core. He had underestimated her pride, her ambition, her appetite for payback. Her first move came quietly, just a week later. An anonymous tip slipped to Marco Diaz, the city's most notorious gossip blogger. The Diaz report was infamous for dragging Manhattan's elite through the mud. One discreet message was all it took. Lucas Grant, Chicago's golden boy of real estate, caught having an affair with his brilliant but ruthless COO, Savannah Blake. The story dropped on a Tuesday morning and spread like wildfire. The headlines were scandalous, the details exaggerated for clicks, but at the core, the story was true. and it was enough to send shockwaves through Chicago's financial elite. The board of Grant Enterprises called an emergency session. The company's stock, already shaky due to Lucas's erratic missteps, plunged overnight. The scandal violated the company's strict code of ethics. It was a PR disaster, threatening to stain the polished reputation Lucas had spent a lifetime crafting. Suddenly, his personal life was fair game for every tabloid and blogger. Paparazzi swarmed him on the sidewalk. Every photo, every strained expression, dissected by pundits and gossip-hungry strangers. The man once hailed as the city's golden king had become its newest cautionary tale. Each flash of a camera reminded him he had built a glass house, and now everyone delighted in throwing stones. In her small, sunlit apartment, Emily read the news with an eerie calm. She had expected it, knew Savannah wouldn't vanish quietly. But seeing her husband's dirt aired out for millions to devour still hit her like a punch to the ribs. Part of her wanted to hide from the headlines. Another part forced herself to read every word, to remember exactly who he was and what she was fighting for. "This is her doing," Emily told Arthur Vance over the phone, her voice flat as stone. "Of course it is," Arthur replied, completely unruffled. "Classic scorched earth tactic. She wants to sink the ship to clear the deck, get him ousted, swoop in to look like the savior." "Will they let her?" Emily asked, anxiety tightening like a vice in her chest. "They might," Arthur admitted. "Which is why we strike now. That prenup you signed? Ironclad. Plus, it has a very convenient morality clause. Your husband just shattered it for the entire world to see." "So what does that mean?" She pressed her hand to her belly, needing the feel of new life anchoring her while the rest of her world tilted on its axis. Arthur's tone turned almost gleeful. "It means leverage, Mrs. Grant. It means we don't settle for crumbs. We go after the bakery. A big slice of it." Arthur's plan was ruthless brilliance. He filed for divorce on Emily's behalf, citing adultery and emotional distress. But the real bombshell was the injunction, a legal move to freeze a large chunk of Lucas's personal assets, and more crucially, part of his shares in Grant Enterprises. The injunction didn't just rattle Lucas, it rocked the entire company. It told the board and every trembling shareholder that this was no ordinary divorce settlement. This was war. This was a hostile play orchestrated by the wronged wife of their CEO. It was Emily's way of telling them all. She would not be pitied, and she would not be dismissed. Lucas was blindsided. He'd imagined a quiet separation, a dignified payout, a graceful exit. He had not imagined this. He had not imagined his sweet, soft-spoken Emily bearing claws he didn't know she had. He called her, voice sharp with a bitter mix of fury and disbelief. This time she answered. Her voice was cool, measured, utterly stripped of the warmth he ached for. "Emily, what are you doing? An injunction? You're going to destroy the company." "You did that yourself, Lucas," she said evenly, each word a blade. "You and Savannah, I'm just protecting my son's future." "Our son, Emily, our son. You lost the right to say our the day you knelt in front of another woman, in my chair." Her words were calm, razor-sharp, undeniable. She didn't raise her voice, but the icy finality in each syllable made him flinch more than if she'd screamed. On the other end, silence. He had no reply, no spin, no defense. She'd cornered him completely. Checkmate. The pawn, Emily Grant, overlooked and underestimated, had just crowned herself queen. She owned the board now, and the king and his treacherous knight were flailing for cover. This was only the opening salvo. The war had barely begun, and as the dust from this brutal first strike settled, one thing was crystal clear. Emily Grant would not go down quietly. The days of tears and begging were gone. Now, every breath she took built the walls of the fortress she was becoming. She would reduce his kingdom to ashes if she had to, and from those ashes, she would build a new empire all her own. The injunction was a surgical strike. It threw Grant Enterprises into chaos. With a huge block of Lucas's shares frozen, his once unshakable grip on the company slipped overnight. The vultures, just as Arthur Vance had predicted, started circling immediately. Board members who had once sung Lucas's praises now sniffed a power vacuum too tempting to ignore. At the center of this brewing storm sat Savannah Blake. The scandal she had gleefully unleashed had detonated in ways she hadn't foreseen. She'd meant to weaken Lucas, make him ripe for removal so she could sweep in as the calm, capable replacement. She hadn't counted on Emily fighting back with such ferocious precision. The woman Savannah had mocked as fragile had proven to be made of tempered steel. The injunction didn't just hurt Lucas, it tanked the company's stability, hurting Savannah's ambitions by proxy. Now the board eyed her warily, seeing her as the spark that set the whole disaster ablaze. She was no longer a solution. She was a liability. Her fantasy of slipping into the CEO's chair was slipping through her manicured fingers. So she struck again, this time, reckless with spite. She fed Marco Diaz another scoop, crafted with surgical malice. A narrative so twisted it would flip the script entirely. Lucas, the poor, manipulated mogul. Emily, the cunning social climber who trapped him with a baby and used tears and threats to extort a fortune. The Diaz report headline dripped poison. It called Emily unstable, hinted at breakdowns, labeled her jealousy pathological. A wife weaponizing her pregnancy for a payout. It was a masterpiece of character assassination and Savannah's last desperate card. The article was a savage hit job. It slammed into Emily like a punch to the chest. Seeing her love for Lucas, her excitement for their baby, warped into something cheap and grasping. It hurt worse than the betrayal itself. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the hateful comments, each word a tiny dagger she had no armor to block. And the public, ever fickle, ever hungry for a new villain, swallowed it whole. Overnight, Emily transformed from betrayed wife to scheming gold digger. Lucas, the faithless husband, was suddenly a tragic victim, trapped in a toxic marriage, led astray by temptation. It was as if her pain no longer belonged to her, but had been repackaged and sold for clicks and gossip. "This is war, Mrs. Grant," Arthur Vance said grimly, reading the headline out loud in his sleek office. "She's not just fighting for a settlement, she wants to destroy you." Emily, who had been so strong, so sure, felt herself cracking. The endless scrutiny, the cruel gossip, the loneliness, it pressed against her chest until she could hardly breathe. Her hand drifted to her swelling belly, an instinctive shield. For a terrifying second, she wondered if she could really protect her child from a world so ready to hate her. "I don't know if I can do this anymore, Arthur," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I feel like I'm drowning." Arthur's reply was instant, ironclad. "You are not going to drown, Mrs. Grant. You're going to swim, and I'll be the shark swimming at your side." Arthur's team of seasoned investigators fanned out, hunting for anything buried in Savannah's past. And what they unearthed was explosive. Savannah Blake, the so-called self-made powerhouse COO, had a secret, a child she'd given up for adoption years ago. The daughter she'd wiped from her perfect narrative in her ruthless climb to power. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The same woman smearing Emily as a manipulative mother was herself an absentee one. The irony tasted bitter on Emily's tongue. This was the same cruelty Savannah had weaponized against her. Arthur's eyes gleamed like a predator scenting blood. "This is it. This is our silver bullet." But Emily's stomach twisted. To drag an innocent child into this filth? It felt wrong, like sinking to Savannah's level. She cupped her belly protectively. "I don't want to hurt her daughter," Emily said softly, tears brimming. "This isn't about the child," Arthur said, voice low but relentless. "This is about exposing Savannah for the fraud she is. It's about evening the odds. If you want to win this war, Mrs. Grant, this is how." Emily closed her eyes. She thought about her baby boy, about the world he'd be born into if Savannah won. She pictured the cruel headlines, the whispers behind his back, and she pictured Savannah's cold, unfeeling eyes. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she forced herself to see past her disgust, to the bigger battlefield she couldn't afford to lose. Her resolve calcified. "Do it," she said, voice a razor-edged whisper. The story of Savannah's secret daughter didn't go to Marco Diaz's scandal blog. It landed, like a missile, in the hands of an investigative reporter at the New York Times. It was a calculated strike, aimed to give the story weight and credibility, to present it not as rumor, but as a sober exposé on the character of a high-powered executive. The fallout was instant and devastating for Savannah. The piece, deeply sourced and carefully written, painted her as a woman so ravenous for power she'd severed the most primal human bond. The public, so eager days ago to spit on Emily's name, now turned on Savannah with savage delight. The wronged career woman was now a monster, a modern-day Medea in a designer suit. The board of Grant Enterprises, already jittery from weeks of scandal, saw their worst nightmare confirmed. Savannah Blake wasn't just a risk, she was radioactive. In a swift unanimous vote, they fired her. Breach of ethics. Irreparable harm to the company's image. Overnight, Savannah's empire of carefully curated power crumbled to dust. Her career, her influence, her spotless reputation, it was all gone. She'd played with fire and was devoured by the flames she'd set. Lucas, watching it all unfold from his penthouse, was a man in quiet agony. Some bitter part of him felt grim relief seeing Savannah fall, but it was drowned by the deeper guilt curdling in his gut. He had made her. He'd fueled her hunger, enabled her cunning, and worst of all, he had stood by while she butchered Emily's name. He knew he couldn't fix it all, but he could do something. In a move that blindsided his attorneys and rattled the board, Lucas called a press conference. He didn't stand before the cameras as the unshakable mogul. He stood there as a man cracked wide open. He confessed. The affair, the lies, the betrayal, the shame. He claimed every scrap of blame, owning every cut he'd inflicted on his wife, every ounce of damage he'd done to his company. He announced he would take an indefinite leave from Grant Enterprises to focus on putting his life back together, starting with trying to earn back the trust of the woman he still loved. It was shocking. It was raw, and it was also shrewd. By gutting himself publicly, he robbed his critics of more ammunition. He took back the narrative with the oldest trick in the book: brutal honesty. In her small apartment, Emily watched it all unfold on her laptop. Her heart twisted in knots. Pity, fury, sadness, and something that might once have been love, all colliding behind her ribs. She saw the pain in his eyes, the truth in his voice. But she also saw the man who'd broken her, the man who'd let another woman sit where only she belonged. The war was far from finished, but the battlefield had shifted. And for the first time, Emily Grant knew she held the high ground. Savannah was gone. Lucas was humbled. And Emily, the pregnant wife who had once stepped into her husband's office and watched her world crumble, now held unimaginable power in her hands. The future of Grant Enterprises, the destiny of the man she had once trusted with her whole heart, it all rested with her. The unraveling was complete, and from the wreckage, a new, uncharted future was ready to rise. Lucas's public confession detonated like a bomb in Chicago's elite circles. It wasn't just gossip, it was a spectacle, a royal downfall watched by millions. The king had stepped off his throne, stripped himself bare before the ravenous, judgmental eyes of the world. For Emily, watching the broadcast from the quiet cocoon of her new apartment, the moment was a tangled knot in her chest. There was no sweet triumph, no joy, only a hollow, ghostly vindication. Yes, he had finally spoken the truth. But those words should have been whispered to her in the sanctity of their home, not offered up on a stage to rescue his dying legacy. Following his last loyal advisor's pleas, Lucas vanished from the public eye. He retreated to the sprawling Grant family estate on Lake Michigan's shore, a grand cedar-shingled mansion he hadn't willingly visited since his father's funeral. Now, the grand hallways, once echoing with lavish parties and summer galas, were silent, but for the creak of old floors and the soft murmur of waves outside. He wandered the empty rooms, the briny lake air sharp with salt and memory. Sometimes he stood in his father's old study, surrounded by shelves of thick, leather-bound volumes on ethics and legacy, books he had once mocked as outdated relics. In the glass reflection, he barely recognized the pale, hollow-eyed man staring back. This was no luxury retreat. It was a self-imposed prison, an attempt to claw his way back to the man he should have been, the man Emily had once believed he could become. Back in Chicago, Grant Enterprises was a ship in a storm without a captain. The emergency boardroom meetings were little more than theater, desperate men and women masking panic behind silk ties and forced smiles. Loyalties that had been forged over decades, over high-stakes deals and backroom dinners, now cracked and splintered like brittle glass. Whispers of hostile takeovers and shareholder mutinies slithered through the marble corridors. "We're hemorrhaging value," grumbled Lawrence Meyer, a portly, perpetually flushed board member who had survived 3 CEOs before Lucas. His confession was a disaster. He made us look weak, rudderless. "No," countered Chen, a sharp-eyed, ambitious executive half his age. "He didn't make us look weak. He made us look like what we are. The rot started at the top." The Savannah Blake affair proves it. Into this den of circling sharks, Arthur Vance made his move. He requested a formal audience for his client, Emily Grant, before the full Grant Enterprises board of directors. The request sparked disbelief, then suspicion. "What does she want?" Lawrence Meyer barked during a tense conference call. "To bleed us dry? To stand over the carcass and pick the bones clean?" Arthur's voice sliced through the static, precise as ever. "Gentlemen, you are legally bound to hear her out, and trust me, you'll want to hear what she has to say." Desperate for any sign of stability, they grudgingly agreed. The days leading up to the meeting were a crucible for Emily. Savannah's smear campaign had left scars that still ached in quiet moments. The thought of facing that room, powerful, sneering men who saw her as nothing more than a complication, made her stomach twist into knots. "I can't do this, Claire," she confessed one night, her hands resting protectively on her belly, as if her unborn son could lend her courage. "I'm an art curator, not a CEO. They'll eat me alive." Claire, steady, unflappable Claire, took her hands and squeezed. "They're expecting the weeping wife. They're expecting a victim. You will not give them that. You will give them the mother of this company's future. You're not doing this for yourself, Emily. You're doing this for Theo." Theo, the name she and Lucas had once whispered in softer, sweeter days. Now it was her armor, her battle flag. With Arthur drilling her on corporate bylaws and Claire rebuilding her spirit piece by piece, Emily prepared. She devoured financial reports, memorized market forecasts, studied blueprints for stalled developments. Somewhere in those long nights, she uncovered a spark, a sharp, strategic mind that had been dulled by years of soft luxury and false security. She was not just Lucas Grant's wife anymore. She was becoming herself. On the day of the meeting, she chose her armor with care. A simple, elegant navy dress that framed rather than hid her pregnancy. Around her neck, a single strand of her grandmother's pearls. No more, no less. Flanked by Arthur and Claire, Emily stepped into the boardroom on the 50th floor of Grant Tower. The air smelled of tension and overpriced cologne. A dozen pairs of eyes, some doubtful, some outright predatory, followed her every move as she crossed to the head of the long mahogany table, the very seat where Lucas Grant had once ruled without question. Lawrence Meyer looked her over like she was an insect he could crush with a single dismissive swipe. She let the silence stretch just long enough, meeting each pair of eyes without a flicker of doubt. Then Emily began to speak. Her voice was clear and steady, carrying through the boardroom like a quiet storm. She did not mention the affair. She did not speak of betrayal. She spoke of legacy. For 50 years, she began, Grant Enterprises has been a pillar of this city's ambition. But in recent months, we've lost our way. We've valued profit over principle, growth over ethics. The foundation my father-in-law built has been compromised. Not by market pressures, but by a deficit of integrity. As she spoke, she could feel the weight of generations pressing on her shoulders. And for the first time, she did not shrink under it. Then she laid out her vision, each word sharper than the last. She spoke of pivoting towards sustainable, community-focused development, of building genuine partnerships with the neighborhoods they touched, of crafting a corporate culture where transparency and accountability weren't just slogans, but measurable facts. Every sentence chipped away at their skepticism, replacing it with a grudging, growing respect. She had charts, she had projections, she had a realistic, costed 5-year plan. She wasn't emotional, she was surgical, calm, persuasive. Lawrence Meyer, barely able to contain his disdain, finally cut in. "This all sounds very poetic, Mrs. Grant, but this is the real world. What do you want from us? A bigger payout? A conscience fund?" Emily met his scorn head-on. "What I want, Mr. Meyer," she said, rising slowly, her presence filling the room, "is the future." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The shares frozen by the injunction represent a significant stake in this company. My son, the heir to the Grant name, will inherit them. I am not here to dismantle this empire. I am here to rebuild it. I am here to protect my son's birthright." She let the word son echo a second longer than necessary, watching every hardened face in the room twitch with the reality that the next Grant already existed, and she controlled that future. Silence. The mere mention of her child, Lucas Grant's undisputed heir, shifted the room like a tectonic plate cracking. "I don't want to be CEO," she continued, calm but unstoppable. But I will take a seat on this board. From that seat, I will ensure this vision becomes reality. And I have a candidate for CEO, Daniel Chen, a man of integrity, experience, and the respect of this entire room. All eyes turned to Chen. The young executive's face flickered from shock to dawning respect, then a quiet, steady pride. Emily hadn't just come with a plan. She'd come with an alliance. She had cornered them and given them a way out at the same time. And in that moment, every man in that room realized she was no longer asking for power. She was taking it. The vote, when it came, was a mere formality. Unanimous. Emily Grant had walked into the lion's den and walked out its queen. Word traveled fast on Chicago's power circuit. At the Grant estate on Lake Michigan, Lucas got the call from a stunned, bewildered Lawrence Meyer. He listened, knuckles white around his phone, as Meyer recounted every detail of the boardroom upheaval. When the call ended, Lucas felt no rage, no bitterness, only a raw, humbling awe. Every word replayed in his head like a verdict he'd sentenced himself to. She had saved him, and everything he had squandered, yet owed him nothing. The gentle, art-loving woman he had married, the woman he had so carelessly betrayed and underestimated, had just rescued his father's legacy from the wreckage of his own failures. She hadn't burned his empire down. She had rebuilt it, stronger, wiser, unshakably her own. A few weeks later, as the first crimson leaves drifted down Chicago's tree-lined streets, Emily gave birth to Theo Grant. Holding him for the first time, she felt a quiet peace flood through her. Every moment of pain, every battle, every cruel headline, they had all led to this perfect, warm little miracle sleeping in her arms. In his tiny heartbeat against her chest, she heard her own resolve echo back. Never again would she be powerless. Never again. Lucas heard the news from Arthur Vance. A single, curt text message. He drove back to the city, a man hollowed out by shame and lit up by a fragile, desperate spark of hope. He found her in a plain hospital room. No couture robes, no towers of extravagant flowers. Just Emily, in soft cotton, cradling their son beneath the glow of a bedside lamp. The skyline glittered outside the window, a city humming unaware while this small world turned without it. Lucas froze in the doorway, a ghost haunting a family he no longer knew how to claim. His eyes clung to the curve of her shoulder, the protective way her fingers traced Theo's downy hair. So familiar, so unreachable. She looked up, her eyes found his. There was no anger left in them, but there was no invitation either, just a calm, watchful quiet that made him ache down to his bones. He stepped in, his expensive shoes silent on the cheap linoleum. "He's beautiful." His voice cracked. The words tasted too small for what he felt. "Yes," Emily said, her tone soft but unyielding. She looked back down at Theo. "He is." She didn't ask him to come closer, didn't offer him the weight of the baby he had no right to hold. The space between them was vast, miles wide and years deep, cluttered with all the wreckage they'd made together. And yet, in the quiet rise and fall of Theo's breath, he glimpsed a fragile thread of hope, one he knew he didn't deserve but couldn't stop craving. Lucas stood there, a king in exile, watching the two souls who were everything, knowing he belonged to neither. The public reckoning was over. The boardroom war was won. All that remained was this quiet, bruised moment, painful, uncertain, real. It wasn't an ending. It was the first, trembling step toward some distant dawn he could only pray he'd be worthy enough to see. The story of Emily Grant is a reminder that the deepest betrayal can forge a strength too fierce to break. We followed her from the dizzying fairy tale heights to heartbreak's lowest abyss, and watched her rise, not as a victim, but as a victor. Her fight wasn't just for herself, but for the world her son would inherit, a testament to the relentless power of a mother's love. But the final question lingers. Can a love so violently broken ever truly be rebuilt? Can Lucas Grant, humbled, stripped of pride, ever be worthy of the second chance only she can give? So the story is over. Our wonderful friends, are you still here with me at this hour? If you are, then maybe, just maybe, something in Emily's journey touched a quiet corner of your heart too. Maybe you see a part of yourself in her, a part that once felt small, betrayed, underestimated, but found the courage to rise anyway. Emily's story reminds us that betrayal doesn't have to define us, it can transform us. As Rumi once wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." Sometimes the deepest cuts shape us into people we were always meant to become, stronger, wiser, and impossible to break. What Lucas destroyed, Emily rebuilt. Not just a life, but a legacy. Proof that love, when turned inward as self-respect and fierce hope, can save not only ourselves, but generations after us. She didn't need permission to reclaim her power. She just decided her son would never see his mother bow her head in shame. And maybe that's what I hope you carry away tonight. That your heartbreak, whatever shape it takes, can be your blueprint for something stronger. That you are allowed to rewrite your story, just like she did. If you felt even a spark of that courage tonight, if Emily's fight stirred something sleeping inside you, then please, my friend, do me one small favor. Like this video, share it with someone who needs reminding that storms can cleanse as well as destroy. And subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story that might just heal a hidden bruise inside you too. Stay strong, stay gentle, and remember, sometimes the end of a fairy tale is the beginning of a legend.